Trust the profits, the flight line of horse racing content. Salutations and welcome, friends. My name is Matthew Desantis, and this is episode 2 of Countdown to Keeneland on the Trust the Profits YouTube page. Make sure to press that like button. Make sure to subscribe for all of the great content we have here on the channel, not just Countdown to Keeneland. You got daily double picks with Colin and Vinny. You got El Hombre doing stuff. You got the Formulator doing stuff. We got so much content every single week for races across the country, across the world. And this episode of Countdown to Keeneland, we're looking at the Breeders' Cup. We're only 8 weeks away. It's amazing. We're into September. The first weekend in November at Keeneland is just around the corner. We got some of the final Breeders' Cup prep races coming up. And so what do we do here at the Countdown to Keeneland? If this is your first episode, well, we do a couple of things. One, we recap what happened the week before as it relates to the Breeders' Cup, and specifically as it relates to the Breeders' Cup Challenge win and you're in races. This way, you know which horses are going into which races in which divisions. We recap what happened the week before. We look ahead at the Breeders' Cup Challenge races in the coming week and look at the fields that are going to be competing in those contests. Give you a little bit of handicapping advice, a little bit of thoughts on how those races might just shake out, and then also share with you news about the Breeders' Cup, share with you news about what's happening in terms of what horses are shipping over, maybe horses that are going to try to sneak in another prep race, where that's going to be, how that could potentially shake things up in the division, etc. So we like to review, recap, and then rewind and talk a little bit about the news that's taking place. So we have a lot to get at this week because of the recap. And we might as well just hit it off the top. Don't bury the lead. The lead is what we watched last Saturday in the Pacific Classic. Some of you might have been watching college football, and quite frankly, I feel sorry for you. Although I got to say, I got to give a shout out to my alma mater, the University of Florida. Not only that, I got to give a shout out to my other alma mater, Furman University. Why? Because the Florida Gators' new football coach, Billy Napier, Furman alum, went to school with me back in the day. So got to give a shout out to Billy. So college football is great. We love it on Saturday nights. But the story Saturday night in horse racing was the Pacific Classic and the truly historic effort put in by Flightline. Flightline, of course, qualifies for that Breeders' Cup Classic. As you can see here, we have Flightline qualifying. Earlier in the day, we had Olympiad, but we'll get to Olympiad in a second because he's going to run second, I think, to a lot of things in this particular contest. But Flightline, obviously the story of the Pacific Classic, everybody was wondering, could he get the distance? What was this two-turn experiment going to look like? This was a decent field. I know some people attacked the field. I don't understand that. Country Grammar won the Saudi Cup. I mean, we saw Country Grammar beat some of the best horses in the world. Beat Hot Rod Charlie, beat Life is Good, did the distance of 1.25 miles on a deep track in Medan. We've seen Royal Ship turn in good performance again and again and again. We've seen Express Train be the gatekeeper, if you will, of West Coast dirt classic horse racing. Stiletto Boy has always been able to be a thorn in people's side, always been able to run competitively. This was a good field. But Flightline made them look like they were running on a different track, quite frankly. And it was stunning to watch. Colin and I did a live watch and reaction, which you can find here on the Trust the Profits YouTube page. Remember to like and subscribe. But the big thing that came out of that race was, first of all, just the sheer ease with which Flightline won by 19.5 lengths. 19.5 lengths. If you've not watched this race yet, pause this, go and watch our reaction and viewing of the race, because you can watch the race on that video as well. But it was awe-inspiring because he's running fast fractions, 23 and 2, 46, basically 46 flat, opening half mile, and then just proceeds to start pulling away. And it was so reminiscent of Secretariat. And I know that might sound blasphemous to some people, but part of it was when he started making that move, middle of the backstretch and just start separating himself and going into the third and fourth turn. It's just widening and widening and widening. And everybody else is just getting further and further behind. And you think, oh my God, is he going to have this epic collapse? Is he going to just run out of gas? And is everybody else going to catch up? And he gets to into the lane, and Flavien Prat, the jockey, just shakes the reins a couple of times and see you later. He's off to the races, and it was all over. But it was all over maybe when they left the starting gate. I mean, Flightline just turned in a truly dominant performance. The doubters have to be quieted at least a little bit. I know there are some people who, are still upset that he does not run as often as perhaps they would like. I get that. What he might mean from a siring standpoint, passing on that fragility. I get that. But it was absolutely breathtaking to watch that horse run. And he's run against very, very good competition. And I get people say, well, we're going to see what he's going to do against a big field, a 12, 13 horse field. And here's the problem, folks. Nobody's going to want to run against him. And that is an issue, which we're going to get to later this episode. But as you can see on the screen, these are the horses that have already qualified for the Longines Classic. And there's another monster in this graphic, as you can see. But Cafe Faro has already qualified. He was the first one to qualify at the February Stakes. Olympiad actually has qualified twice. Actually, I have him down here twice as well. But he's qualified through the Stephen Foster and the Jockey Club Gold Cup. Cyberknife qualifying through the Haskell. Life is Good qualifying in the Whitney. And then here's the other monster, the William Haggis horse, Baid, who is just a monster. Now, he runs on turf. So, whether or not he would ever consider, running in the Classic, I doubt. But a lot of Europeans chimed in and chirped up when people were talking about Flightline to just remind everybody about Baid, who's actually faced a very similar trajectory in some ways. Not nearly as lightly raced, but has been a horse that has been running at a mile his entire career and just recently ran that mile and a quarter and ran it impressively, winning a Group 1, the Judd Monte International, just a couple weeks ago, beating Mishriff, who we're actually going to talk about later this episode. So this is kind of your field right now for the Longines Classic. But the question is, does that effort from Flightline scare other people off? Do the other potential contenders of the Breeders' Cup Classic, the Life is Goods of the world, maybe even the Happy Savers of the world, the Hot Rod Charlies of the world, are they scared off and do they go to the dirt mile instead? And maybe we end up with a 12-horse monster, or 14-horse monster dirt mile field. We'll have to see. But certainly that performance was just jaw-dropping. Bob Baffert had a very funny line. I have very mixed feelings about Bob Baffert, but when it's funny, it's funny. And he joked with Mike Joyce of TVG after the race. He goes, my horse, Country Grammar, is walking around thinking he won the race. And Country Grammar, of course, finished second by 19 and a half lengths and had no idea, apparently, that he lost the race. So it was just a dominating effort, truly a once-in-a-lifetime horse and truly a once-in-a-lifetime effort and performance. So we can only wait to see what's going to happen. John Sadler, the trainer of Flightline, said that the intent is to go to the Breeders' Cup. That will be the next race, to go to the Classic. He once again reaffirmed his position that the ownership group wants to run this horse at 5 years old. So they expect him to come back as a 5-year-old. I mentioned before, the Pegasus World Cup seems like a potentially logical pointing spot after the Breeders' Cup Classic. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. But let's not shortchange Olympiad. Olympiad ran earlier in the day in the Jockey Club Gold Cup up at Saratoga. Is one of the only horses in the world, actually, that have won 2 winning you're in races and Breeders' Cup Challenge races, and did so very impressively in that Jockey Club Gold Cup. Really put away the competition. American Revolution, who finished second, ran at him a couple of times. And each time he did, Olympiad just pulled away a little bit more. Very good effort, very good bounce back effort as well for Olympiad from the Whitney. A lot of people, there were a lot of question marks. Bill Mott even didn't have a lot of good answers for why he turned in that performance. Was the pace too fast up front? Was he bothered by the heat that particular day? Not really sure. And that was a good bounce back performance, though, from Olympiad in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. I also think, though, it's important to point out, while it's a grade one when you're in race, that was about the level of competition that Olympiad usually beats. I mean, he's beaten American Revolution before. He beat him at the Stephen Foster, actually. He's beaten, some of these other horses, and horses like Dynamic One, and some of the other horses that ran that day. These are not overwhelming horses. Keep Me in Mind hasn't really run much at all. Tax is a horse that was really in over his head. So a lot of the other horses in the field didn't really present a legitimate challenge. It really was kind of American Revolution and then everybody else. And inevitably, American Revolution gave it a good effort, but that horse might be better at a shorter distance. Remember, his only grade one is the Cigar Mile, so he might be better at a mile rather than a mile and a quarter. But Olympiad, very good horse, but like I said, probably my fifth or sixth pick, honestly, in the classic. I'd probably go with Epicenter over him. I'd probably go with Hot Rod Charlie over him. Probably even go with Happy Saver over him if he's in here. Certainly with the Flightline. Maybe not Life is Good at a mile and a quarter. I think Life is Good at a mile and a quarter has some issues. But, this is it is certainly an exciting division. We can't wait to see what happens next. Now let's move on to some of the other races that took place over the weekend, this past weekend. And we'll go to the Del Mar Handicap, and you see the latest entry on the Longines Turf Winning You're In Challenge races, and that is Gold Phoenix, a name that really came a little bit out of nowhere. This was a very promising horse, very promising young horse that had won a couple of allowance races out in the West Coast. This was its first graded stakes effort in the grade 2 Del Mar Handicap, and it was an absolutely thrilling race where you had both Gold Phoenix, you had Masterpiece, who had won the grade 2 Eddie Reed just a few weeks before, and Dicey Mochara, all coming right down to the finish. Gold Phoenix just barely out finishes by about a nose Masterpiece, who I think you can expect to see Masterpiece in the Longines Turf. I mean, this is now two very strong efforts coming back from a pretty significant layoff, a win in a grade 2, a second in a grade 1. He's got a fair amount of points to qualify for the Longines Turf. I wouldn't be surprised if that's where he is going to go next. And two very, very strong efforts from him. But Gold Phoenix bursting really onto the scene, and I think that's exciting. I think one of the things that we've seen both on the East Coast and the West Coast is that we've seen a lot of the same names in turf racing over the last couple of years. I mean, how many times have we turned on a New York turf race and seen Gufo and Channel Maker and Rock Emperor and Tribhuvan? I mean, these horses feel like they've been racing against each other for years and years and years. And so it's nice to get a little bit of, a break from that and to see a new face. Last week, I actually mentioned a horse named Soldier Rising, who finished third in the Sword Dancer, another kind of new face on the scene. I think there's a reason that myself and others really love the horse Santon as well. Kind of a new face on the scene, burst onto the scene last year in the Hollywood Derby, and has followed it up with 2 grade 1s this year as a 4-year-old. So I'm excited to see some of these new faces in American turf racing, Gold Phoenix being one of those. Very impressive turn of foot. I mean, he came closing like a freight train down the middle of the track at Del Mar. And so that was a really great effort from him. And then we'll go to the Filly and Mare Turf, which turned in the biggest upset of the weekend, which was the upset of Warlike Goddess and the victory of Chad Brown's Virginia Joy, who gets the automatic win and you're in invitation to the Filly and Mare Turf at the Breeders' Cup. And while Virginia Joy deserves all the credit in the world for winning this race, she absolutely crawled up front. Tactically, it was a very smart ride, saving all of her energy and still having plenty down the stretch to ward off those coming late. And I mean, I think it was a 51-second or 52-second opening half mile. I mean, very, very slow pace. 1:16, I want to say, opening 3/4 of a mile. So you're looking at a very, very slow pace. Ultimately, the story, though, is Warlike Goddess, who was the overwhelming overwhelming, I think 1-5 or 1-9 at post time, the overwhelming favorite in this race. And I got to say, Joel Rosario, who's the jockey of Warlike Goddess, should probably write John Sadler and Flightline a thank you note. Because really, until Flightline ran on Saturday night, all horse racing Twitter was talking about was the horrific ride that Joel Rosario had given to Warlike Goddess. And it was, I rarely am somebody to blame a jockey. You know, if I lose a bet, if I handicap a race and it doesn't go the way I think, my first reaction is not to blame the jockey. My first reaction is to blame myself usually. I look at myself and go, oh, what did I get wrong? What did I miss? So I'm not somebody here to bury jockeys. That's not what I do. And certainly not here to bury jockeys as talented as Joel Rosario. All of that said, I think it is fair to criticize jockeys sometimes and go, was that really the right decision? I mean, Warlike Goddess was handled as if she needed to save every inch of ground possible. And Warlike Goddess has won at a much longer distance than the 1 3/8 that race was run at. She could easily handle going a little wide. And by the way, it's a 6-horse field. She's not going that wide. She's going, what, 2-3 wide at most? But Rosario really kept her in the pocket and kept her inside, covered up. And at no point did she look comfortable. And that was something I noticed during the race. I just kept saying to myself, I go, God, she just looks uncomfortable. And she didn't. She just didn't get into an easy gallop at any point and an easy stride at any point in the backside. She looked like she wanted to go, but she couldn't because he's behind this glacial pace and he's tucked in and he can't get back outside. And so it was just some decisions that Rosario made that I just really question. And he's been known to ride a little too overconfident on favorites, not just on Warlike Goddess, but on a lot of horses. And that was one where I think you can certainly second guess some of his decisions. I think that's fair. Now, that doesn't mean Joel Rosario is a bum of a jockey. He's a great jockey. He does some things on turf that, it just baffles the mind sometimes in a positive way. He also does things that baffle the mind in a negative way. That's fair to point out too. But Warlike Goddess certainly will get that invitation to the Philly Mare Turf. We'll see. I mentioned last week that she was maybe pointing at the Longines Turf and running against the boys. We'll see if that's still the case. Bill Mott is a pretty classy guy and didn't really throw, Rosario under the bus afterwards regarding the ride. But it was, you could tell he wasn't thrilled about it. And, but ultimately, Virginia Joy is the benefactor of this, and Chad Brown gets his filly into the Breeders' Cup in this race. And so then we'll finish up with the Turf Sprint, which was the final of last week's Win and You're In races. And that was won by Lieutenant Dan in the Green Flash Handicap, the grade 3. Now, Lieutenant Dan is a horse that I really like a lot. Probably the best West Coast turf horse, but took a really long layoff and has only kind of recently come back. But he's done this the last couple of years where he takes these really long layoffs, then kind of runs a prep race or two, runs to the Breeders' Cup, and then takes another really long layoff. And that's kind of what he's doing again this year and just kind of shaking off the rust. And to be honest, he really was so much better than the rest of the competition. And that's not to speak derogatory of the rest of the competition. It was a grade 3 race, though. Lieutenant Dan's more of a grade 1 level horse, honestly. He may not win a lot of grade 1s, but he's a grade 1 level horse. I mean, this is a horse that finished second to Golden Pal last year in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint. This is a very, very, very good horse. So, he was another one. It's interesting. He had it was a sprint, so it's a little bit of a different dynamic. But he also had a little bit of a questionable trip, only in that he was tucked inside and he really needed something to open up. Now, he was right behind the pace, and typically you can expect a hole to open up, especially in sprints where horses will tend to go a little wide around the turn because the speed is carrying them out a little too much. And so you can usually dart inside in sprints in a way that sometimes is more challenging in a long distance marathon race like we were talking about earlier. But what you can see with this ride is he's just waiting. And all of a sudden that inside hole opens up and he's off to the races. And it was really over as soon as he hit the home stretch and snuck through that inside path and showed a lot of class too. I mean, just a great horse to be able to see that hole on the inside and go through it and attack it so aggressively and not be scared by it. That's something a lot of younger horses and even seasoned horses will sometimes be a little timid about going through that inside rail. And he had no problem at all. And just like I said, easily kept away all the competition. And so he's a horse I'm excited to see in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint because, like I said, he's just a horse that just shows up every time, turns in really honest efforts. And certainly this is turning into a really nice field with Highfield Princess and Nature Strip, who's just an incredibly impressive horse. And then Casa Creed, who's Bill Mott's sprinter who came back from Maidan and immediately won the Jaipur. And it just, like I said, really, really good horse. Love Casa Creed. Such a good horse. And to be able to come back from overseas and win in a grade one first time out is just so impressive. So with that all being said, let's turn to this coming week. And there's a bunch of Breeders' Cup Challenge races this week overseas. We're going to touch on one of them. Next week, I'll recap all of them, but some of the fields are not yet announced for the overseas races. And anybody who's watched racing in England knows those fields can be pretty significant. So rather than running through a lot of horses that may not end up running in those races, I'm just going to focus on the one race overseas that did actually draw their contenders and draw their entries. And so before we get to that, though, there's two races at Kentucky Downs, which are win and you're in races. And the first, the FanDuel Turf Sprint, which is 6 furlongs over that undulating Kentucky Downs turf. If you've never watched Kentucky Downs, it's very an up and down track. It's a very European style track with a lot of undulation, up and down, uneven terrain. It's a very funky configuration with kind of a hairpin turn on one side and a very broad turn on the other side. And so they're kind of going uphill towards the end. Like I said, very unusual for American turf sprinting. One of the things I tend to look at is what horses have run on this track before, what horses have experience on this track and over the surface. Do they like it? Do they not like it? How did they respond in the past? I think that tends to be a pretty good indicator. The other thing in turf sprints from a handicapping standpoint, I would really look at horses that are used to running 6.5 or 7 furlongs here. If you're looking at a horse that only ever runs 6 furlongs or maybe even 5.5 and 6, I'd be a little worried in this race. Only because, like I said, that undulating turf usually takes it out of a horse. So you really want a horse that's used to running a little bit longer and has a little bit better stamina, 6.5, 7 furlongs. Those horses tend to do a little bit better. You see the same thing with like the downhill turf course out at Santa Anita. Typically, horses that maybe run 7 furlongs a mile, cutting back to that 6.5 out there, tend to do pretty well. Same thing I really hold true here at Kentucky Downs. Now, that said, you look at this 12-horse field, very competitive, a lot of really interesting horses. Arrest Me Red, being the morning line favorite, has drawn the far outside. So that is certainly a question mark for Arrest Me Red, how he's going to handle that far outside post position. But he's also never run at this track. So that is a big question mark. How does he handle this turf? It's an unknown. And so I think, he's an appropriate favorite in that he's beaten all of the other top contenders in this race. He's beaten Brand before, easily by about 2 lengths. He's beaten Gregorian Champ before, who's the kind of the next closest choice. So he's beaten a lot of these horses that are, the next closest contenders. So it's understandable that he is the favorite in this spot. But still, the track itself is the X factor, I think, here. So I don't have any problem with people who say, I think Arrest Me Red from a handicapping standpoint is the best horse. But I also understand from a betting standpoint going, I'm not going to bet this horse. I'm going to try to maybe go after a little bit of value. Maybe you go with Brand. Maybe you go with Gregorian Chant. I'll give you a couple of other horses I kind of like. One in particular, Chewing Gum. I think this is a really nice long shot. It's a Bill Mott horse, jockeyed by Joel Rosario. Now, Joel Rosario and Warlike Goddess, you heard what I just said, but you also heard what I said about turf sprints. Joel Rosario is a genius, and he's one of the best turf sprint jockeys I've ever seen. And so this is a horse that ran pretty well in Chewing Gum. Last time out, finished 4th in a grade 2 at Woodbine. But here's what's important. That was the first race back in 7 months. This is now the second race back off a long layoff. I think that's a pretty good thing. Now, granted, he ran on this track before and didn't run very well. But that said, he ran very poorly the race before that last year. So last year he ran in the same race, finished 8th. The difference was he came into this race last year having finished 8th in the Troy at Saratoga before that. So he was kind of on a little bit of a funk. Runs the year, doesn't run well last year, but has run well since, and is, I think, coming in slightly better form and better shape. So I think Chewing Gum at a really big price might be a nice horse to use. Maybe not up top. Maybe you'll use this horse underneath, but I think you're going to see a big effort out of Chewing Gum. Well, let's move to the other of the win you're in races at Kentucky Downs this weekend, and that's the Kentucky Turf Cup. And this is one where another huge 12-horse field. And the real shocker in this field is Gufo. Gufo just won the Sword Dancer 2 weeks ago and is now entered in the Kentucky Turf Cup and is the morning line favorite at 7-5. Now, I don't know if he's actually going to run. Maybe he scratches. Maybe Clement just entered him and saw kind of, I don't know, play it by ear, see what happens. But the reason I'm shocked by it is this is not sprinting. It's not uncommon to see sprint horses come back on a 2-week rest. Even elite sprint horses can come back off a 2 or 3 week rest. Not uncommon. What is uncommon is to see an American, and I want to preface that because overseas they will run these horses a lot more often. What is unusual to see an American turf marathoner coming back on 2 weeks rest. He just ran the Sword Dancer 2 weeks ago, now comes back. To be clear, Gufo has never, in his career, in his 19 career starts, has never run on 2 weeks rest before. In fact, has never run on less than 4 weeks rest. So Gufo is in kind of a class by himself compared to the rest of this field. But from a betting standpoint, I just can't wrap my arms around that. And so then you're looking at, well, where else are you looking? Well, I mentioned, how distinct and unique Kentucky Downs is. Horse for a course, Arklow, 7-2 on the morning line. This is a horse 4 for 4 at Kentucky Downs, 2 wins, 2 second places. Hasn't been in the money much lately. Hasn't been able to win much lately. But Arklow at Kentucky Downs is about as automatic in terms of finishing up top or close to up top as you're going to get. I'll give you a long shot, a big long shot that likes Kentucky Downs. Glynn County, 30-1 on the morning line, 2 for 2 hitting the money at Kentucky Downs, including a win last year. Also a third place effort a few years ago. So Glynn County, another horse to keep in mind, maybe use underneath 30-1. That's a real nice price. The other horse that's worth mentioning, I think, in this field is Temple. I like Temple a lot. Temple's a horse that just traditionally runs second, third. Did have a breakthrough win at Gulfstream a few races back, and this is a second back from a layoff, so we should see a good effort from Temple. Always turns in a very honest effort. And the other thing to notice here, you see a lot of Mike Maker trained horses. Maker has been on fire, winning at, I think, a 25% clip already at Kentucky Downs in this very short meet. Both he and Safi Joseph have had a fair amount of success at Kentucky Downs. Well, let's move to the last win-and-you're-in race of the weekend, and that is the Irish Champion Stakes, taking place over in Leopardstown. And this is a stacked field. This is a just silly looking field from a standpoint of class overseas. So this is 1.25 miles on the turf, obviously. There's a few names that really stick out. Broome, Mishriff, Luxembourg, and Tuesday all really stand out. 3 of them are Aidan O'Brien horses. And Broome, we just saw recently, actually over here, and didn't run particularly well in that Sword Dancer, actually, and is coming, went back overseas and is running again. Again, Broome runs very regularly. This is not uncommon for a horse like him to run this regularly. It would still be a little surprising to see him bounce back this quickly against this level of competition. That said, Broome does tend to do his best bounce backs overseas, where, he may not run great in America, goes back over to England, runs well. So certainly a horse to keep in mind. Luxembourg is another interesting horse in that very impressive 4 for 5 in his career winning, has never run on the turf at Leopardstown, did win at 10 furlongs last time out, so can do the distance. The only loss in his career was this past April. He stumbled at the start, And so to some extent, maybe you say, well, I tossed that effort. Otherwise, this horse is undefeated. Very, very talented young horse. And so that's a horse to certainly keep an eye on. Onesta, another horse I like a little bit for Fabrice Chape's horse. This is a son of Frankel, has won at 12 furlongs. Actually, last time out, so distance is not going to be an issue. Already has 2 Group 1 wins in 4 career races. You might be able to get a little bit of a price on Onesta. Uh, One of the other 2 final horses I'll mention is Tuesday. This is obviously the filly running against the boys. Second to Alpinista last time out. 4th at the Irish Derby before that. Race before that, very impressively won the Epsom Oaks. So Tuesday's very, very talented filly. Not sure if she's able to stack up against this loaded of a field, but always turns in a very strong and gutsy effort. But the horse that I'll talk about as a personal favorite of mine is Mishriff, who I just think is just a fantastic horse. One of my favorite horses from overseas. The John Gosden horse ran second behind Baid, that absolute monster who is undefeated, 10 for 10. Mishriff ran second in that race in the Group 1 Jed Monte last time out. And honestly, outside of the Saudi Cup last year, this horse just does not run bad races. He always runs really honest, always runs really well, and he runs against the very best competition. In most of this horse's races, the majority of his races in his career have been Group 1 efforts. So this is a horse that goes up against the very best and wins a lot and holds his own all the time. So expect a strong effort there, and getting any of these horses to come over for the Breeders' Cup would be thrilling, to say the least. Well, that does it for the information in terms of recapping and previewing the races from last weekend and this coming weekend. But there's still a little bit of news that I want to share with you first. I mentioned at the beginning, Flightline's victory at the Pacific Classic could scare off some horses. And indeed, Horse Racing Nation caught up with Life is Good's trainer, Todd Pletcher. Pletcher, I will just say, was very cagey about where Life is Good is going to head for the Breeders' Cup. He kept focusing on the fact that they are training Life is Good for the Woodward Stakes, his next race. Here's the thing. The Woodward Stakes traditionally is at Belmont. It's not at Belmont this year. It's at Aqueduct. Why? Because they're doing construction at Belmont, and all of the fall meet at New York has been moved to Aqueduct. Now, why is that a big deal? It's not that big of a deal, maybe, but traditionally the Woodward at Belmont is a 1-turn race. Now, at Aqueduct, it's a 2-turn race. Now, Life is Good has demonstrated that he can win at 2 turns. That's not a problem. Did it at the Pegasus, did it at the Whitney, no problem at all. But it's still an interesting dynamic to throw in there. Pletcher was very cagey, though, about where he would go after that. Did not say, I'm definitely going to the Classic. Said, we'll see how we come out of the Woodward, basically, which I understand is a very political answer. But he did say it would be great. He doesn't, he wants to kind of go up against Flightline, see what these two would go up against each other, run up against each other. So it certainly seems like he does want to be, someone who contributes to the sport, in that he wants to put these great horses against each other. But certainly what happens at the Woodward will be a big factor into that. Some other news not related directly to Breeders' Cup Challenge races, but both Taba and Adair Manor are headed to Pennsylvania next for their next races. Both of these are Bob Baffert horses, and Adair Manor is headed to the Grade 1 Cotillion at Parks, and Taba is headed to the Grade 1 Pennsylvania Derby. Both of these horses I would expect to be pointed toward their respective divisions in the Breeders' Cup, with Taba probably pointed towards the Breeders' Cup Classic, considering, if he comes out of the Pennsylvania Derby in good shape. Adair Manor probably headed to the Breeders' Cup Distaff as well. She's a very, very good horse in her own right. And so we'll see, obviously, how they run in those particular races. But that appears to be the prep races for both Taba and Adair Manor. It should be pointed out, Baffert was less than committal on whether or not Country Grammar would run again in the Awesome Again Stakes, which it would be kind of the next most logical Breeders' Cup prep. So we'll have to keep an eye on, see what that Awesome Again Stakes looks like. And then finally, Wesley Ward pointing Golden Pal to a dirt sprint race. That's kind of interesting, that he's probably going to go to the Phoenix Stakes next, which is a dirt sprint. And Golden Pal is, of course, a champion turf sprinter who has only ever run once on dirt, his maiden effort, where he finished second. It'll be interesting because Golden Pal came back from overseas, came back from Ascot, and turned in a pretty mediocre performance at the Troy. Now, granted, Thin White Duke, who finished third that day, came back to win a stakes race next time out. So maybe that field's shaping up better than we thought, but really struggled. Like I said, in that Troy, it's interesting moving him to dirt to maybe just, get a prep race in, not really think anything about it, and then get him back on the turf. Sometimes switching surfaces can perk a horse up, going to dirt and then back to turf can sometimes perk a horse up a little bit. So we'll see what ends up happening there. But I think it's noteworthy, certainly, that he's pointing Golden Pal towards the Phoenix Stakes as a prep potentially for the Breeders' Cup Turf. So always a lot going on there. So that's where I'll finish today. I appreciate everybody tuning in to the second episode of Countdown to Keeneland. Make sure to come back next week. We'll have recap all those races I talked about and more, and then also preview what's coming up the following week. So always a lot of great stuff, and keep you in tune with the latest from the Breeders' Cup. Now, in the meantime, don't forget, remember to like and subscribe to Trust the Profits page, not just for my stuff, but for everybody's stuff. We got picks. We got, we do live play race reactions. We do, highlighting horses. We highlight races well in advance. We just have so much content for races. Like I said, coast to coast, all overseas, for the best stuff out there. Make sure to like and subscribe. Trust the Profits. Okay. Until next time, friends, take care. And remember that it's now post time.